this Taste and Talk series was a component of the Sustainable Streets Plan. And for those who don't know, I did a comment last night, one of our famous our Sustainable Streets Plan fans here, realized this is the Sustainable Streets Plan. This is about 497 pages. Yeah, it is here. It is part of, this plan has always been part of the Sustainable Streets Plan. This was a grant project funded by Caltrans. It was, we received a grant in 2012 to do the Sustainable Streets Plan. And as part of the grant application, there was a whole idea of how do you approach and engage the public in an innovative way. And this was it. So the Taste and Talk series was something that we've never done before. We've never done like a speaker series. We've never done sort of a public engagement, public education forum. And what we've normally done is the normal workshops, the community workshops, commission meetings, and city council meetings. But this is definitely something new. And we had originally programmed to maybe do 8 or 9 of them throughout the year, and we have now done, this is our 11th, we've done one every single month this year. And so I didn't want to end last week in October, because I wanted to actually have an official ending, and this is the official ending, so that everyone knows that you're not going to call me in December and be like, hey, when's the next Taste and Talk? You can still call me, but it's okay. So that's what we've done. And the Sustainable Streets Plan, this is a component of the Sustainable Streets Plan. And the Sustainable Streets Plan is 2 major movements. It's a movement of complete streets, which is how we balance all the different modes of transportation on the existing public right-of-way. And then green streets, and that's how we treat stormwater within our street. How do we clean the water, essentially improve water quality in our creeks and the bay through the street system. And so that was the Sustainable Streets Plan. And I'm about to go through all 1,200 slides or 1,200 slides of the presentations now. I cut it back. So what I did, just to let everyone know, it may be a little sketchy, it may be a little, not a complete presentation as smooth as I'd like. There were technically over 1,000 PowerPoint slides from the 10 presenters that we had. And so I went through today and cut them all down. And there, I've cut them down to about 300. So, I know Jessica's like surprised. But I am going to move very fast, and that's why I wanted to start really quickly. So it's not intended for you guys to read everything, but I wanted to make sure we highlighted every single one of the speakers and what they have. So I'm going to talk really fast, faster than I am right now, and we're going to dive right through it. So with that, does anybody have any initial questions?
You've done a great job.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. So that's a great segue. I wanted to just, again, thank you guys all, because especially Friday night, one, this is the only time we can get the library, and then to actually come to all these events. We initially started with over 100 people coming to these events, and as we dwindled down, we have probably about 60 people overall for the entire series, which is really incredible because a lot of times it's not the normal people that we see at every single city council meeting, city commission meeting, but it's a way for us to actually reach out to new people, and I hope that you guys are all still involved in everything that the city does in the future. But I wanted to thank Kevin, because he just walked into the room before we started. Kevin is here. He was the one who's, thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. Kevin played a big role. He actually is newly hired, only a few months probably, but without him I probably wouldn't be able to do it. I panic sometimes. I get here right before the presentation, and he's been able to help me out quite a bit. And then I also want to thank Jessica Alba, who is here with her kids there. She'll be highlighted in the presentation, not in picture form, but she obviously is my main counterpart in the Sustainable Streets Plan as we move forward, and she's been a big partner. And she's a city San Mateo resident too, so I always like to highlight that. All right, so let's start, and I am gonna fly through this, and so just hold on. I talked, it was sort of like a workshop in here a while ago about the climate action plan, and it was somewhat like speed dating because we had to move so quickly. And that's what it's gonna be like. Not that I've ever done it, My wife and kids were going to come tonight, but I told them that the presentation is going to be probably at least 45 minutes. My kids are, there's no way they'd sit through it. So, all right. So, first off, I cannot beat last week's Taste and Talk event. So for those who were here, we watched the Giants game before and we watched the Giants game after. I cannot top that. As much as, you know, that was fantastic. So, yeah, Giants game. Okay, so we started off in January with Jeff Tumlin, and the presentation was about sex, neuroscience, and the city. And I can't top, and I will say that I'm not the expert. I cannot do what each presenter did, but I will summarize as best as I can. And I may get a couple things wrong, but that's okay because they're all videoed, and so you can go back and actually watch it if you want something more in detail. So, we talked about sex, neuroscience, and the city, and the idea was that there is a neurological sort of not mentality, but memories about the car, especially for the baby boomer generations. It was their life. They thought as soon as they got the car and the keys to the car, they were off. It was their freedom, you know, and things are slightly changing. And you can see that from the presentation, or from the slides, that there was some sort of sexiness to it. That's how it was advertised. And when you go into the World's Fair and you think about, you know, how the automobile industry changed, and how it became sort of that iconic item that you need to have back in the 40s, 50s. Cars were a major movement throughout for us. But we also thought, you know, there's also the Jetsons in terms of, you know, are we moving towards that direction? But we're not. And the idea is that he also mentioned about Disneyland and Autotopia, which I was actually at Disneyland a couple weeks ago with my kids. This is one of the more popular rides. It's the kids who can actually go ahead and drive their cars. This is a big deal. And cars still will be with us for a long time. So, but when we go ahead and we say the cars, this is what we want to do everything for cars, this sometimes would happen. And when this happens, you know, you end up being sort of very frustrated, very angry. You know, there's something about traffic congestion in cars, and if we kept moving down as business as normal and business as usual, you know, I hope we would never get to this point, which I don't think we will. What we wanted to do, as Jeff mentioned, is we wanted to go back to when we were kids and have that freedom of when you're out riding your bicycle, and the idea you had that freedom of moving around, you know, walking, or writing. You know, this is the type of stuff in terms of what he talked about in terms of neuroscience, about the happiness of what you feel like when you're out there free. And then we think about how the baby boomers are aging, and the thing is we definitely need to make sure we have the facilities for them. So, what to measure? When we talked about level of service, LOS, it's how we measure the traffic congestion as it is. This is, unfortunately, I don't know if you can see that, level of service F. You know? And then this would be level of service A. And the idea is, what do we really want when we think about how we measure and how we actually plan for society? So from a traffic engineer standpoint, there's no way that cars can move through here. But definitely cars can move through here. But which place would you rather be at? But then he said from an economist standpoint, you know, this is really what you want. There's no way that you wouldn't want that in any city. So the idea is there's a difference in terms of level of service. And he started going and when we talk about level of service, the issue is that for us to maintain the standard that we have, which is mid-level D for level of service, we essentially have to add more lanes to keep the traffic moving. And so when that happens, you know, we widen the roadways, so then, you know, and then people are happier, but so they're faster driving. And then more people drive, and then there's more congestion. And this keeps happening until basically everyone gets upset again. So, he was mentioning that I was at another presentation that Jeff Tumlin was at, where is the Caldecott Tunnel and the fourth bore. Caltrans spent billions of dollars on the fourth bore, and they expect it to last for a while in terms of relieving the congestion, for a few years at least, but it only took a few months before the congestion was back. And so the idea is if you actually widen the roadways, You're just actually encouraging more people to drive, and you'll end up with more congestion. And this is in terms of, not congestion, but you think about the demographics, and what's happening is that the millennial generation is actually driving less, and they're getting their driver's license at a lower rate, because they care more about their smartphones than they do about their driver's license. And so as we age and as the demographics changes, how do we deal with things? And there is a correlation to driving and driver's license. The other issue is that as Americans as a whole are driving less as well. This is a statistics that vehicle miles traveled for the entire nation. And has been a drop since 2005, overall, nationwide. We also learned about the tree canopies and what it does in terms of housing prices, that the denser the trees, there's actually a direct correlation to housing prices. We also learned from New York City about when you go through and make these improvements, there are direct increases to injuries and economic development. As you can see, when you do parklets, which I'll talk about a little bit more, there's an increase in sales. Again, as you put in these improvements, there's direct correlations to safety and economics. And this is what we kind of want. The idea is we want to have people gathering. We want a really vibrant area in terms of for the city. And we also want to make cycling pleasant and safe and attractive. We are looking at, instead of the 3% that is strong and fearless, we are looking at the 60% here that is sort of encouraged to ride. Everyone who's out there riding right now, it's those road riders in the spandex and latex, not latex, the spandex, Lycra. Thank you. It's Lycra. Thank you, Mike. It's the 3%. We actually are targeting the 60% of people. Everything that we do, we're trying to encourage and be more bicycle friendly. So that was Jeff Tumlin's. We opened it off and kicked it off really fast. And then we dove into Michael Mole and Paul Tchaikovsky. Michael Mole is a former member of Nelson Iker. He now lives in Hawaii. But Paul Tchaikovsky is from the Local Government Commission. And each one of our consultants here came and did a few turns on the Taste and Talk series. So we talked about complete streets, and what is complete streets? And the reality is that this is a really clear example that, hey, there's something wrong here, right? Or here, right? In terms of mass transit. Why is this guy right here when there's a concrete pad right there? In some ways, there's some stuff that's wrong. Or when you think about this guy here, and you think, we've got a curb ramp that goes to nowhere. So this is a real clear example of what complete streets is. That's very vivid. But overall, what really is complete streets is that all streets should be for everyone, no matter who they are and how they travel. And that they should be safe, comfortable, and convenient. And that we look at it for everybody. So you think about, it's not just the kids, but for those who are also aging, the seniors as well. So that's why there's a complete streets, and it's a huge movement throughout the United States. And we talk about pedestrians in terms of pedestrians. Every trip that you make starts and ends as a walking trip. So the idea is that everybody's a pedestrian. And then as you deal with the different modes and how the distances to where your work and your home is, the idea is that if we can have more people closer to within 1 mile of their work, home, or their destinations, they're sometimes more likely to walk. Or 46%, you're more likely to walk 1 mile less for church and school, or 1 mile less, 35% of people are more likely to walk if they are close to work. And then the other thing is, like, as I mentioned before, is that the millennials, they are driving less. They are actually looking for different transportation options as a whole. And going back to the VMT issue, is that there is a drop. And you can see, again, nationwide, Americans are actually driving less. And then the future of vehicle miles traveled in terms of VMT is unknown. Because of this drop, we're not exactly sure where it's going to go. But you can see that if the trend since 2007 is going down, there's some major implications of how we deal with streets as a whole. So, complete streets, we want to ensure that the entire right-of-way is planned, designed, constructed, operated, and maintained to provide safe access for all users. And then there's some benefits he went over. There's a major benefit to older adults. There's half of all non-drivers over the age of 65 would like to get out more. These are directly from national statistics from the National Complete Streets Coalition. Benefits to children. 17% of kids are technically obese at the moment, which we'll go into a little bit more. There's limited physical activity, and there's issues in terms of having safe places for them to walk and ride. In terms of the disabled, 1 in 5 Americans have some sort of disability. And then complete streets, we need to make sure that we pay attention to the details for these users. And then transit overall, we talk about the different modes. There's a direct relationship to transit and how we provide those sort of benefits. Safety-wise, these old numbers, 32,000, there were nationwide 32,000 traffic fatalities, of which 23,000 were people in cars, but 4,200 people were pedestrians, and 618 people were bicyclists. And when you look at the disparity there, and you think about the percentages are really skewed because people who are walking and people who are riding, they're not surrounded by the one-ton car with the airbags and everything else. And you see that there's a major safety issue. Let's move forward. So when we go ahead and we do these improvements, there's statistics that show that when you're adding sidewalks or hybrid beacons or medians or different roadway improvements, these are the statistics about what it does in terms of the safety, the overall safety of how we improve things. Going to safety as well, which we'll talk about, is that the faster the vehicle is going towards and collides with the pedestrian, the more likely that there's going to be a fatality. And then in terms of health, we looked at, there's obesity rates, and you can see that the different countries in terms of, if they walk or ride more, the difference in terms of obesity, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then also diabetes as well. So the more that their communities walk and ride, the less of an issue in terms of diabetes is an issue. And then the CDC, the Center for Diseases Control and Prevention, they do recommend complete street policies in order to combat some of these health issues as a whole. And then in terms of the economy, there's lots of studies that were done in terms of the benefits. Just roughly in New York, there's been, in terms of them making these improvements, they've done statistics about how there's less commercial vacancies and higher retail sales. And the millennials, they do want this stuff. And so the issue is, I know we're not just planning just for the millennials, but the reality is that they are a different demographic, and we do need to plan for how they move or how they want to move throughout the cities. And so the idea is that they do want more multimodal issues. And this is a graphic in terms of capacity. When you think about, here's 40 cars, 40 people by bus, 40 bicycles, and then people walking, the idea is, are we really planning the streets enough for every single user, or are we really just planning them for the single occupant vehicles? The idea is definitely to think differently. Oh, there's also a climate change issue in terms of greenhouse gases. Sorry. And then we talked about green streets. Green streets in the National Complete Streets Coalition, they do include green streets as part of complete streets, which segues into Phil Erickson's from CDNA. This is the presentation that we had in February, I think, March. So we talked about green streets. And again, there are two components, complete streets and green streets. And what are green streets? Green streets are integrating the streets into the context and natural environment. It's a way for us to handle some of the debris and treat the water quality. Essentially, I always say this, and I've said this many times, I always think of Sal Castaneda from Channel 2, when you have that first flush in the rainfall in the fall season, and he says, hey, be careful out there because it's oily and wet, right? And the idea is that all that oil, all that debris that builds up over the summertime, it runs right into our storm system and runs right out into the bay. And that's why we have sometimes some poor quality issues, water quality issues. So the idea is, in terms of green streets, can we do something at the street level to help the water quality for the environment? Because things have changed. When you think about the natural cycle, before we urbanized, in some ways, a lot of the water used to infiltrate here. But now everything runs straight off into the collection system. So looking at this graphic from San Mateo County, essentially 30% of on-surface and below surface used to flow into the natural creeks. But when we changed this system, essentially 80% of our system, 75% runs sort of into pipes, and then there's about 5% that runs into our creeks and channels. And it just completely runs, and its water is essentially treated as a waste rather than a resource. And so the idea is that everything was built into the sewer systems to actually to get rid of water as quickly as possible, and that's why sometimes we have some flooding issues. So the idea is that if we incorporate green streets, we might have more of a balanced system here, where we actually have more infiltration, which we actually can treat water and slow down water before it hits the channels and the creeks. So the Sustainable Streets Plan talks about, again, combining complete streets and green streets. And green streets as a whole, there's lots of major win-wins for, again, green streets and complete streets. There's a lot of pedestrian benefits for it, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And these are the different types of green street features: rain gardens, plazas, linked tree wells. I'll explain. So as an example, rain gardens. Has anybody been to Burlingame Avenue lately? In terms, yeah. So their new Burlingame Avenue, and then on the backside on Donnelly Avenue, they have rain gardens at each of the corners. And it's their way of treating water before it hits the storm system. And so that's a rain garden. We also have, these are another example of a rain garden, is a curb extension. So here's where you get the win-win with the pedestrian, because as you do in a curb extension out here, there's a major safety benefit towards the pedestrian because they're not in the street as well. And instead of having just regular landscaping, why don't you have a green street feature? So this way it helps treat the water. Vegetative swales is another topic. Green gutters, I haven't technically seen this one, but I really want to. So I hope someone does it sometime. Linked tree wells, which I think would be probably a little bit more what we would do if we did something downtown, because it's a little bit more urban in terms of the available space. And then infiltration trenches. So essentially we don't have anything connected to the storm system. All the water that goes into the system, it's sort of like a big well, and it percolates back down into the ground. So it sort of recharges the groundwater. Permeable paver is another issue as well. And these are all different types of green street features. So that was green streets. And then we moved into Thomas Carmeyer, and then Jeff Tumlin came back. So Thomas was from CD&A, and then Jeff again was from Nelson Nygaard. And we talked about completing the transportation network by looking at the bigger picture. And what was the bigger picture? Well, and why does the transportation network matter when it comes to the Sustainable Streets Plan? So as I've mentioned before, and so a lot of the stuff we'll sort of start combining because, again, it's every single month. There's differences, there's similarities in presentations. Again, essentially for decades, we've been very auto-centric. And the idea is that now we're looking to be a little bit more multimodal. And when you look at the evolution, or in some ways, as Thomas put it, the de-evolution of the streets, San Mateo has been really lucky because we actually developed a lot before the 1950s in some ways. We had a grid network that was set up, and there's major benefits to a grid network versus post-1950s, post-World War II, which is very similar to Foster City. There's drastic differences to how we deal with the development as they occurred. And I'll explain that. The grid network actually can accommodate more growth and more traffic congestion because it sort of gets dispersed throughout the network. Versus the other system here, for example, in Foster City, when a new development goes in, those streets, those arterials, those collectors, those major roadways, everyone goes onto those roads. So there's a major difference. And basically, again, the larger the streets they become barriers to sort of community life as a whole. There's, the larger the streets, the less inviting it is to pedestrians and bicyclists, or to any other user except for motor vehicles. But things are changing. Things are changing. And when Thomas looked at it, he said in some ways that the streets themselves are now the social networks in some ways. When now everyone's on their phones, on their computers, how they're really interacting. But when you're actually out there on the street, that's when you have that real impersonal connection in terms of how you socialize. So he looked at a challenge and how do we basically, improve the network. In the city of San Mateo, it's the Sustainable Streets Plan. And when other cities, and what he was looking at, is how do we go about looking at each different mode in terms of walking and riding, and you look at our network and how do you prioritize those? So as an example, for vehicles, this might be how we prioritize the existing street network. But then for walking, we look at this, and then for bicycles, you would have, or pedestrians, so bicycles was the previous one, and then pedestrians might have different routes. But then you essentially layer them all together to have different priority choices. And that's kind of how the complete streets policies are. It's a balance. It's how we balance all the different modes on the public right of way. And the city of Mateo is doing that. We started with the pedestrian, that's the bicycle master plan. And then we have the pedestrian master plan. And in each of those master plans, we identified specific streets that were going to be more bicycle or pedestrian friendly. So, and then we learned about Santa Monica, which was a really great case study as we went through this whole thing. Santa Monica decided to look at it, and they said, we wanted to make sure and how we deal with traffic that in terms of walking, we want to promote walking. So they looked at their existing retail core and said, we want to make sure that everyone can walk within 10 minutes to the neighborhood shopping centers. Now this is really cool because they said, all right, well, we have some areas where you can't walk in 10 minutes to your local store. So they actually went through and started thinking about maybe rezoning different areas. Am I right, Jessica? Yeah, this is her presentation. They started rezoning certain areas to make sure that they could have, a 10-minute walk, and so that everyone could walk around Santa Monica. And then they looked at make sure that in terms of a 10-minute bicycle ride, that everyone could ride throughout the city. And then also in mass transit, that they looked at that, make sure that everyone was around, or not everyone, I don't know how you do this, but to make sure that you could walk within 10-minute routes to transit service that operated every 10 minutes. And so it's a big deal. Santa Monica is a great example for what we were looking at. I mean, they're a much bigger city and they have a lot more support staff, but it was a great example. And then we moved into health, and Jessica was here along with Dr. Ogilvie, who came and talked about the direct impacts of health and our public infrastructure. So he mentioned in the very first thing, which is very true, is that the first traffic engineers were actually sanitation engineers. And there was a study that in London actually was the first traffic engineer. And part of the issue was way back when, there were issues where basically everyone just dumped their waste out into the street, and all the garbage just went out into the street, and you were walking around in basically the sewers. And so the thought is, well, how do you actually move that stuff away? And they came up with they looked at the sewer system, the sanitation people, and said, well, hey, we're now getting more cars. How do we move cars fast enough? And they essentially have the same system. And so I'm not explaining this right, but if you think about our pipe system, from Hetch Hetchy in terms of clean water, there's really large pipes. We can all walk through them, right? But then when you get down to your street in your home, the pipes are only about 4 inches or 2 inches in diameter. And the idea is, same thing with the streets. The idea is when you move more people, the roads are really large, and then when you get smaller, to your neighborhood, the roads are really small, the local neighborhood streets. And so that's how it was developed. So he went through it, but by doing that, there were major consequences to actually your health. And so if you make it so that it's easier for people to drive and there's really wide streets and you can drive really fast, more people are going to drive, and then the problem is that we have higher obesity rates. And as an example, when you go through the yearly analysis by the, I think it's the the CDC, you can see that the nation is changing as a whole and basically becoming more and more obese as you move along. To a point that in 2009, there's a good portion of the United States is over 30% of the population is obese. So going from 1985 to this, where at least California was less than 10% of the population was obese, to now, which is at least 20 to 24% for California alone, is obese. There is an issue. We have to deal with this. And part of the issue is our public infrastructure as a whole. So San Francisco did a study where they said that overall, there's $15 million associated annually that goes towards pedestrian injuries. So when we talk about safety and your personal health and what it does direct impact to the actual health system, there's direct correlations to the people who are public infrastructure as a safety-wise. If we don't make it safer, basically healthcare costs and everything, it's going to rise. And then again, going back to New York City, they did a study that when they do these improvements, there was a 26% decrease in terms of crashes. Also, sort of a 58% decrease in injuries to overall street users as they make these improvements. And then going along with it, Dr. Ogilvy talked about the grid pattern again. This is as you walk to school. It's a nice, easy, quick walk to school. But can you imagine the old system? And I'll just say not to knock on Foster City, but Sam Taylor, I think Foster City, right? This is how they'd have to get to school, and then they come back around, and instead of walking directly across, they have to be driven, and there's all these points of conflict points. And the idea is that if you have a grid network, you have different kind of lane requirements versus if you have a very isolated and disconnected system, you need these much larger streets. And so luckily for the city of San Mateo, again, we were built back earlier in 1906. That was when our big explosion, then before World War II ended. We have a very good grid network for most of the city. And then you talked about the design. When you think there's differences, there's these 5 Ds. And the design, the idea is that you go through and you add bicycle lanes, you narrow the lanes, add some street trees, and then you can get some diversity and you get some density in some ways. And you can change the way the streets are developed. And then there's also sort of an economic impact in terms of when you're building these streets, what does it actually do? And there's just road-only construction has a job creation of 7.8 people, but cycling projects actually, you have more people in terms of actually creating jobs. And then there's another statistics for every half mile or quarter mile that you're closer to a trail in Minneapolis, they found that the housing prices or the median home values actually increased. So there's a direct relationship to being closer to a park. This is actually to a trail, but there are some other statistics, I'll go side topic here, that if you are directly adjacent, your home's directly adjacent to a park, there's something like a 3 to 5% increase in your home value alone, just because you're right next to a park, because you have those amenities. And then we talked about in terms of health, if you ride more, if you're more active, these are statistics that 32% of the people are actually, we call it sick. There's a direct impact to the health costs as well. So, and then this productivity. And then we got into, as we keep moving along, we move Jessica's in terms of, pointer here, the dark truth and bright future of parking policies. There's a direct relationship to parking policies and how we are mobile. And the idea is, basically as a synopsis, the more parking we provide, the more we encourage people to drive. So, actually, I probably just gave you the synopsis here. but she had this great graphic of, here it is, if you're going to go, if you have a trip for 1 mile, what are the different options, right? You could walk for 20 minutes. You can ride public transit, it might cost you a couple dollars. You can ride your bike for 10 minutes, it's free. Or you can drive, and it's also free. And the idea is we need to think about things a little bit differently if we're trying to encourage more multi-modals. So we had to think about what really happens with parking, and how does parking actually get developed? So you got the land cost itself, and then you have, as you build a structured parking, it becomes $5,000 per space for it's a vacant lot, $25,000 for an elevated, and then you go down below, and it might be more like $35,000 per space. And these spaces, actually, I've seen numbers for an underground parking garage that goes up to probably almost $80,000 per space. So it just depends. So that when you think about, especially I'll just use our library as an example, as we go down the 3 levels or underneath here, all those empty parking spaces, there's a direct cost to actually how much they actually cost in terms of construction. And the issue is, but the problem is that we always have thought, well, not always, but there's this big sort of notion that everybody wants parking and they want free parking. And they'll come unglued if we don't provide free parking. So how do we change this? How do we do things differently? Because things are changing. Again, the millennials are driving less. The baby boomers are retiring and their car ownerships are actually decreasing. You might still own a car, but maybe you don't drive as much. Or maybe you get rid of your car. but because people want more park space. They want to be able to actually move a little bit more than before. They want to be able to walk around. These are the type of places that people want to actually socialize. And so what we have to do is balance the cost of parking with the demand for parking. And how do we do this? And the issue is that there's a direct relationship to parking in everything that we do. And Jessica explained that, and this is sort of the science behind it, sort of the engineering behind it, is that there's so many different things that we look at in order to provide parking. From the ITE manuals to the actual requirements to the hour restrictions. How do we actually deal with parking as a whole? And there's lots of things that we can do. There's lots of changes if we want to. And you have to look at what's right for maybe us might not be right for other people. What works here in downtown San Mateo may not work for up in the hills over off of Campus Drive. And so there are differences in how we have to deal with these things. And the idea is that parking requirements shouldn't be just a set limit. There should be sometimes ranges depending on where you are. One of the greatest quotes that I kept this in here is that during the presentation, the idea is that if you gave away free pizzas, just as much as we gave away free parking, we would never have enough, right? Because everybody would want it. So the idea is that we have to manage parking as a commodity, and we have to deal with it. Because if we made parking completely for free, again, we would just never have enough parking. So, and the idea is, again, to think differently, is that maybe we should think that, okay, we should be thinking that, yeah, we have to pay for the parking because there is a cost. Instead of just saying like, in our parking code, we have minimum parking requirements. So when a developer comes in and says, I want to build X, we say, okay, well, you need this much parking. The idea is, maybe we shouldn't be saying you need a minimum. Maybe we should say you can only have so much, maybe. And so that's the difference. And it's talking about rethinking the different parking requirements. And so the idea, again, is about, do we not maybe eliminate or maybe we reduce the parking requirements as a whole? And I'll say that the city of San Mateo is actually pretty good at doing this. So as a side topic, in the corridor plan or in downtown, we do have, in the corridor plan itself, we do have somewhat flexible parking requirements. And so we are doing this. In the downtown, our parking requirements are different from everywhere else in the city. So there are differences and we are doing that. But if we eliminate it, would there be sort of an apocalyptic issue here because we're not providing free parking anymore? Or would we have something more like this? And the idea is we'd have to look at that. This is maybe what we would want instead of basically all the congestion that we have. So I'll speed along because in the Bay Area, actually there are jurisdictions that are doing this. They are looking at different parking requirements, including us, as I mentioned. And things do matter. I mean, the idea is that just because we change the parking requirements means that we're not going to stop all construction. The idea is that there is a demographic of people who will change their mode of transportation, who will drive less, and we talked about the millennials as a whole. And then we have to actually look at parking as a whole system, and we have to balance it in terms of how do we think about providing the parking? Do we have the meters, and do we have Zipcar and car sharing and sort of and bicycle corrals? You have to think about the different modes as parking as a whole. And then she went into parking structures, and you think about parking as a when we build parking structures, we have to build them right, because when you look at this, instead of looking at an empty parking space, you're going to think about how much it actually costs to do that. And what if we actually spent a little, we built less parking, but put all that money into different improvements? So, and then she went into actually there's a cost. There's a free parking space is not necessarily a free parking space. There is a cost to actually, a monthly cost per space to actually maintain it. So there's just these different statistics. And the idea is that as you went through and you provide these parking requirements, if you have a high minimum parking requirement, you actually get more supply, you get more auto trips, and then we get more traffic congestion. So if we have a lower demand for more multimodal transportation, which again has a negative consequence on the environment. So as we go through this and we cycle through, the issue is that if we have really high parking requirements or minimums, then we actually induce more driving, and then basically we essentially need more and more parking. And then this is what it could look like. And this is not typical of San Mateo. There are some spots in San Mateo that could look like this. But the issue is that we could have an oversupply of parking for some places. And so the idea is we need to change the way we look at it. So you go back to this graphic and say, okay, it's still free. There's still 2 minutes. It's still free here. But maybe it's just like a little nominal. You got to have the actual cost of parking. What people actually have to pay for parking so that they realize that there's some cost to free parking. And then we just went into the parking systems. Again, you had to treat it just like Redwood City as an example, or this is Santa Monica again. You look at it from an entire system. The city should be looking at parking as a commodity rather than just sort of giving away. We need to manage it, because we need to manage it per the Goldilocks rule, which is essentially saying that the right price for parking is the lowest price at which a few spaces are always available. So the idea is that we should manage parking so that no matter when you guys drive, that there's always a space available, but there's a certain cost to it. If we make it too cheap, then there's no spaces at all available because everyone's there parked and it's super easy to park. But if we make it too expensive, then there's tons of parking. So the idea is it's the Goldilocks rule, and we've got to find it's normally about that 85% occupancy, about how we actually get to this point. We also have to be smarter about how we deal with parking. Smart meters. We have pucks in the ground. For anyone who doesn't know, there's it's called Streetline. Thank you. That actually they can tell when a car is actually parked there. And so the idea is we need to think about these new technologies as how we advance and how we provide parking throughout. And this is where we want to go. And the last thing that I took this out of order, but I want to highlight this because I thought this was a good slide. Jessica talked about if your home is there and you want to get to this station here, the idea, and we talked about connectivity, is it'd be great if you could walk right through there. It's like a 5-minute walk. But in reality, in this context, this person, there's no access right there, right? You can't get a 5-minute walk to the station. Instead, it's a 15-minute walk to the actual station. And the idea is you want to try and think about how we connect our whole system, the network, the grid network, so that people have different choices and can make these sort of shortcuts by not driving. All right, we're almost there. We're number 7. We have 3 more to go. In July, we talked, Paul Tchaikovsky from Local Government Commission talked about innovative bicycle and pedestrian solutions. Because when you look at it, of all trips, I'll speed things along here, 60% of the trips, when we think about the trips of 3 miles or less, or 1 mile or less, 60% of those trips are driven. And the idea is if we can get some of those trips to be more walking and biking, we can have drastic changes to our environment. Again, we look at the walkability, half mile is about 10 minutes. For 10 minutes for a bike, it's about 1.5 miles. The thought is that, when you think about how you exercise and how you be more, can you actually, exercise 1 hour a day, or, when will you actually exercise? And then things have changed. You think about this is, I forgot his name. Yes, thank you.
Ray LaHood.
Ray LaHood, right? Yeah, as a nation, this is the direction we're going. And he's the chief of the Department of Transportation. The idea is we want to incorporate more walking and biking within everything that we do. And speed matters. As you go through, and as you're driving 15 miles per hour, this is what you see. But as you get closer, you drive faster, this is what happens. And so the idea is there are direct relationships to the faster you drive, the higher the fatalities in terms of if there's a collision. And there's less, you also have to brake more the faster you go. So, again, this is about the speed safety. And then think about in terms of pedestrians, what are the innovative things that we're doing, and we have done this, is that you have to create actual zones. You wouldn't want, as you're walking down the street, a pole right in the middle of the sidewalk. You want to make sure that everything has its place. That we actually provide, instead of a 3-foot or 4-foot sidewalk here, but in the downtown have much wider sidewalks because we expect people to be walking 2x2 or 3x3. The idea is how wide do we make the sidewalks? And then there's the rectangular rapid flashing beacon that has a very high compliance rate at 85% in terms of motor vehicles. And when you push it, it flashes. And so then there's the Hawk system. These are all newer technologies that are coming out. That this will be actually on El Camino at 22nd and 39th within a couple of years because Caltrans is putting these up. And it's a way that the pedestrian pushes the button and it acts as a warning and all the vehicles are supposed to stop. Lead pedestrian interval. We will have this in downtown San Mateo hopefully within the next few months. as we upgrade our traffic controllers. It's the idea that a pedestrian will get 3 to 5 seconds head start before the vehicles can move. So that little green man that you see will actually illuminate. You'll get to walk while all the traffic stop for about 3 to 5 seconds before. So we're actually doing this in downtown San Francisco too. And they talked about public education campaign. The issue is that it's not just infrastructure alone. The idea is that there needs to be education. And the California Department of Public Health actually started coming out with these campaigns, which are great. That, and then how your speed, because there's a direct relationship, again, to speed and safety. So, and then Portland is a fantastic example in terms of bicycling, because they went through and they've done, I'll show you the numbers, but the number one thing in terms of Portland, what in terms of their survey, is in terms of inhibiting them from actually riding more, is safety. And so Portland went through, they're a platinum bicycle city. They've done miles and miles of new bicycle lanes. And here you can see the graph that in 1992, they had 83 miles of bikeways. But then in 2007, it's 271. And they have drastic improvements in bicycling, where in some ways, as a California cities, we always used to look at Davis as being sort of like the bicycle capital of California. Portland has basically become the bicycle capital of the United States because of what they're doing. They're doing drastic things to improve bicycling throughout the city. And then we talked about the bicycle travel lanes, and the idea is that there's a direct relationship to the wider the lanes, the faster you go. So how do we actually reduce the size of the lanes as we move forward? And then we talked about road diets. These are all the innovative things that everybody in public works. I mean, what we're dealing with is, as we narrow the lanes, what can we do? And there's safety impacts to that, or reduce lanes, or eliminate lanes. Buffered bicycle lanes, which we now have one off of Pacific Boulevard I'm really proud of. We have cycle tracks. These are all new things that are coming down the pipe. Raised cycle track, which is really cool. There's actually a separation between motor vehicles and the bicyclists, which is actually a different plane. Colorized lanes, something new as well. Shared lane markings, which these are all new things that are actually all still coming to San Mateo too. The idea is that you put this out here so that the bicyclist rides over and they're outside of the door zone, so they're not technically doored, as what they call it. And they would give these signs would be up so that the bicycle has full use of the lane. Bike boxes, the idea of the bike boxes that you want to move the bicyclists out into front of the vehicles so that they actually are more visible. These are big safety improvements, the turn boxes as well. Synchronized signals, so that a bicyclist, if you're riding, you actually have, if you're riding at 15 miles, 13 miles per hour, you basically get all the green lights. These are definitely new things. Bicycle corrals. There's not a slide of ours, but the idea is you take away parking space and you provide bicycle parking. There's even the bicycle racks. That's actually my niece. Yeah. The only way, the very little secret in all the master plans that I work on, I always have my family in there because it's really hard to get people to sign off and say, yeah, I'll be, here's all the rights to the pictures, right? Especially with kids, you can't do it. You gotta take backs of pictures of kids because we don't have the ability to do it. So, bicycle racks. The idea is that this bicycle rack here, the kid bicycle rack was custom made for us because the idea is that, we want to encourage more kids to ride. If we encourage more kids to ride, then maybe we'll get the adults to ride too. And that's how we trying to move things along. Bicycle lockers. Instead of having just the regular bicycle lockers, these are electronic day-use lockers where there's a key card, sort of a debit card, you pay 3 cents an hour. And the idea is the old way, one bicycle locker could only serve one person. They had a key, they rented it for 6 months at a time, only one person. We had 2-year-long waiting lists for bicycle lockers at our Caltrain station. Here, you just get a card, and these are always open. It's sort of like a parking space, and you basically go in and you pay. If they're open, you put your bike in, you rent it by how many hours you want, and then you're off. And these are great things because you can accommodate up to 10 times as more bicyclists with these electronic day-use lockers than you could with the standard lockers. Because again, if I had a locker and the standard key, I just have one key, that only serves me. And if I'm riding today, but I don't ride tomorrow, that locker still sits, that locker is just there. But here, if you ride every single day, you could use the locker. If you ride once a week, once a month, you could still use the lockers. So these are the type of innovative programs, along with bike share, of how things are moving along throughout the United States and throughout the city of San Mateo specifically. And hopefully within a couple years, we'll have bike share in San Mateo. And the idea is when you think about bicycling is that there are direct impacts to when you make these improvements, how many people ride. So if you provide it, it's sort of like if you build it, they will come. There are statistics there where you show that there are improvements. San Francisco alone, as they are making major improvements, 1% to 2% to 2.7%. There's improvements there. And the idea is that, the smaller the city is, San Francisco is 700,000, maybe 800,000, I forget what the statistic is now. But, the more people who ride, you just make one incremental percentage increase, you're going to see a lot more people actually riding. All right, then we got to the link between transportation and land use, which is near and dear to my heart because I was a former planner. Land use is how we deal with planning, and there's a direct connection between transportation and planning as a whole. Sometimes there's a parallel process because as we look at it, public works has normally taken on the transportation stuff and planning has taken on the private development stuff, but those lines are kind of blurring now. And the idea is that we have similar processes as we go through these things, and basically everything's coming together, like the Sustainable Streets Plan. It's a sort of combination between them. And one of the things that, who did this slide? Thomas Kornemeyer and Jeff Tumlin, one of the things that Thomas mentioned was as you go through the presentation, the slides, you think about this is sort of like the vehicle priority streets. And as we change things along, this is maybe vehicle supportive, but more pedestrian tolerant as you provide these amenities. And then as you keep going, maybe this is actually pedestrian supportive, but vehicle tolerant. And the idea is how do these different things relate in the context that we're in? And in the downtown, maybe this is more of what we'd like to see, but maybe we'd want to see this somewhere else. Well, I don't know if we really want to see this. Maybe we want to see this in other places in the city of San Mateo. And they talked about the 5 Ds. There are links in terms of language: density, diversity, distance to travel, destination accessibility, design. These are the things he talked about. Because there's a direct relationship to the density of an environment and how much people travel. So the less dense it is, the more vehicle miles that people travel, the more people drive. Versus the denser a project is, or an area, people will drive actually less. So the idea is there is a relationship to density and how much people walk and ride. And the idea is that density, we're not talking about huge density. Sometimes it could be 12 units per acre or 13 units per acre. It's not talking about like 20, 30, 40 units per acre, although that would change. But the idea is what is sort of that pivotal point of how many units per acre should we actually develop to encourage more walking and riding? Because people want the public space. They want that open space. I'm going to fly through this too because now I'm really running behind. So in terms of Vancouver, there's a great things in the Taste Talk where we learned about Santa Monica, Portland. Vancouver was another great example. Vancouver has made a really strong point to be more bicycle and pedestrian friendly. Whereas they have grown over the years, an 18% increase in population, 16% increase, 5% decrease in terms of vehicles. And then just in the downtown alone, they've actually had a 20% decrease in vehicles. Because as they've grown 75% in population, 26% growth in jobs, they really want to be more pedestrian and bicycle friendly, and they've done it. They've really succeeded. In the city, the statistics have changed where there are less people who are driving in the city overall, and then also in the downtown. Well, if you look at the rest of the Canadian cities, they're the only Canadian city that actually people are driving less because of the way Vancouver has approached their land use and transportation as a whole. And it was a really great statistics. And then 2 more, public spaces, incomplete streets. The idea of this was Phil Erickson and Jessica. And in San Mateo, we do have public spaces. There's our bicycle corral, one of them. Again, there's my niece. There are alleyways, pedestrian alleyways in San Mateo. During Innovation Week, we had parklets, temporary parklets, which were built by John O'Cone and the CSM students. As an idea, how do you create sort of more public spaces? And so Jessica and Thomas, I think, went into parklets, and San Francisco has a big parklets. The idea is, pavement to parks. It's taking away a couple parking spaces and creating more of a livable place, a parklet. It's run by the Public Works Department, and the idea, these are examples of parklets as a whole. 24th, Valencia, there's different types of parklets, and San Francisco is is a real leader in parklets in terms of converting parking spaces to more livable spaces and more spaces, places for people. But they're not alone, obviously, because it's also a national trend as we move along. Also, in terms of bicycles, the idea is there was a temporary paint and planters for Bike to Work Day. This is Berkeley, I think it was. They actually created on Bike to Work Day new bicycle lanes, just temporary bicycle lanes, and they test case this during Bike to Work Day, which is really cool. Sunday streets, I don't know if everyone knows about that. It's in San Francisco, during the summer months, they close down a particular street and they rotate throughout the city every single Sunday. And it's a great, great thing. They have lots of events. And then we learned about shared space, shared streets. The idea is that the streets could be, certain streets could be, shared with everybody. And the idea is, this is a shared street concept, but you have seating, you have kids playing, you have parking, people can actually drive through here. But there's a difference, there's clear markings, it's not your normal street. So that's a concept that's moving forward throughout, well, I'd probably say it's more Europe, but throughout the nation too. And then we learned about Hayes Valley in terms of, that's a good example of shared street, Linden Alley. What they wanted to do when Blue Bottle Coffee came in, I was actually working in San Francisco at the time when this happened. They said, there was a designer who said, hey, I want to make this alley into a real public space. And they came up with designs and conceptual drawings. And this is how you actually go through the concept to the actual engineering drawings. And this is what it's like now. The idea that this alley, there's Blue Bottle Coffee, is more of a public space rather than just an alley. And looking at it from above, this is what it looks like. It's a real gathering place. People hang out there all day long. So the idea is, how do we treat streets a little bit differently? And then lastly, the last one was last week. Again, I can't compete with the Giants. But Josh Mello did a great job in terms of, he talked about complete streets and sustainable streets. And he talked about what a complete street was if we had all the right-of-way that we possibly could have. With a mass transit and walking and vehicles and sometimes bicycles. This would be great if the street was like 100-something feet wide. But actually it might be too wide. But that would be maybe a true complete streets. But he said that back in the day, what do we expect from our streets? Speed, mobility, and safety. But things are changing. We want them to be more multimodal. We think about public health. We think about the environment. And so these are all things that are changing as we go through it. Again, the vehicle miles traveled is also changing as well. And the speed, here, this is a better graphic. I like this graphic too. About, if you're hit at 40 miles per hour versus 30 miles per hour. There was a reality check that 50% of the funding from roadways comes from cars, but also the rest of the money comes from sales, property, and income taxes. And that everybody pays, so that when we come up with an excuse and say, why are we providing more pedestrian bicycle amenities on the streets, they don't pay for anything, well, that's actually not true. And then we talked about walking and how the investment in complete streets happen throughout the cities. And that as bikeways, that there's a bottom line, especially for Portland. He mentioned that a lot of people are moving to Portland, this was their survey, and they're moving there because it's a bicycle-friendly city. That's crazy to think that people are moving from around the United States, around the world, to move to Portland because they want to ride there, because it's actually easier. He also said that 2 out of 3 businesses, in the surveys, they are actually in San Francisco, that there was an overall impact to them, that there is actually, that the bicyclists actually spend more than cars over a certain amount of time. And then he went through some of the New York statistics, where as you go through these changes, and you make more of a pedestrian plazas and parklets, what happens? There's a 14% increase in sales on the fronting business. So if you put in a parklet, there's a direct impact to that. You lose a parking space, but you might get more retail sales. And then there's other examples of how different cities went in and improved these areas. And then he ended with Morgan Hill, which was something that he just recently did, and he talked about test casing it. Because Morgan Hill wanted to do something like this. There were two concepts. To be more really public space in terms of pedestrians and bicycle amenities, or more of a bicycle amenity in terms of Morgan Hill. And this was an old Caltrans highway that ran through their downtown. And they went through and actually test cased this a few weeks ago and put this down for a 2-week period and created these spaces and showed what it could be like to their public. And I thought that was really cool. How they did this is their buffered bicycle lane. And you can see how they did this for a couple of days, actually for a whole weekend. And so it was a really good pilot case. And what he stressed is, he said 4 things if you can remember. One, that streets have only really been designed for cars just recently, actually in the last 40, 50 years, but recently. But there are hundreds and thousands of places in the United States where you can drive to, but how many places can you drive to where you can actually, or where truly walking and biking? And he said that complete streets could be tested. I like that idea that you could actually test this stuff, and we have done that. The idea is we can keep testing things. And that some of the most successful projects are a combination between public and private. And so Josh was really good. He talked about economic development, and that was how we ended the last one last week. And that is sort of like